Good day, and thanks for joining me. I'm real pleased to be able to have a conversation with my friend Robert Price this morning, and we're going to talk about some touch-based cueing, some touch in general when it comes to manual therapies and voice coaching, voice teaching, voice rehabilitation. So, Robert, thanks so much for joining me. Take a moment to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Walt. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Yeah, my name's Robert Price. I'm a voice teacher I was an actor by training. So I was an actor for many years and an acting teacher and a theatre director. And then I became a voice teacher. And I worked as a voice teacher for a long time in lots of different places, lots of famous schools and not so famous schools. And always used touch in my work, which is something I guess we'll talk about. And then trained or retrained as a manual therapist with Stephen King a number of years ago. And I do both. I still teach voice, but increasingly I use manual therapy as my principal way of doing that, or as a significant part of how I do that. So yeah, I work as a manual therapist in London and occasionally around the world. And yeah, that's me.
Great. So just to give people or viewers an understanding what prompted this talk, I had placed a poll, if you will, an information gathering type of post on a few groups on social media, voice coach groups and related groups, basically asking about touch when it comes to touch-based cueing and the voice coach and how they view touch. And it was fascinating and not unexpected. Some of the responses, everything from, yeah, voice coaching is impossible without it, to no, I never do it, and it's wrong to do it because we don't know our patients or our clients' history, et cetera, et cetera. And it was fascinating for me to just sort of sit back, and I tried to resist that social media temptation of just starting a firestorm and then walking away or observing the fire. But it was really fascinating to see the range of responses. And how did you view those some of those responses or the question in general, Robert?
Well, I thought it was a great question. I think it's a very pertinent question, and from my point of view, particularly interesting as we move out of the pandemic. Well, hopefully, move out of the pandemic, because I think that's another thing that various people I know have spoken about, that perhaps pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic, our use of touch or our understanding of touch has shifted, along with the bigger sort of political ideas, perhaps socially justice inflected ideas that move around. I mean, one thing I think I should clarify is that the thread that I was engaged with was very much for singing teachers, and I think that firstly there's perhaps a bit of a division between singing teachers and acting teacher voice coaches for the spoken voice. But yeah, I thought it was really useful. I'm actually giving a paper with Lydia Flock, who's a colleague of mine at the Voice Care Centre, this weekend, and that conversation was really, really useful in terms of thinking about that. My sense was that there were two big ideas that kept coming through from people who were opposed to touch. Very broadly, some people seemed in favour and conditionally in favour. Some people felt very much against. And the people who were against, the two kind of arguments seemed to centre around the question of abuse. So the fact that touch can be a vehicle for abuse or for grooming or for abusive practices. And then the question of trauma, the question of what does it mean to be touched or to touch the traumatized. And those are both valid. I mean, they're both valid objections. So yeah, I was quite stirred by that, and I've been thinking about it a lot since.
Yeah. I know in my practice as a physical therapist, who my primary tool is touch, manual therapy, and we'll talk about the difference in a moment. It's almost like I'm handicapped if someone walks into my room and says, "I want your manual therapy care, but I don't want any touch." I mean, there's a bit of a separation there. So to me, touch is a natural expression of my work. And it's one that I impart on people, not just to free up the tissue, those older models of the issue in the tissue, but using touch as sort of that metaphor to connect them with their awareness and potentially allow them to create change with me as a sort of a conduit for that versus the creator. So when I introduced that question in a number of the groups, there was a recognition that I was speaking to people who don't have my background, don't have my beliefs, don't have my observations and years of witnessing this with patients. And I kind of saw you and invited you here because of you're kind of maybe bridging those two worlds with as a vocal massage therapist, a massage therapist who sees touch as certainly a valid part of your existence as well as your years without touch. And so, thanks for being here. I guess we need to define a few terms. What is manual therapy? What is touch-based cueing? Do you want to tackle that?
Well, I mean, I think I've got a few clarifications. One is to say that if in terms of your background and my background, although of course they're different in terms of the fact of your particular expertise, but for me, in the tradition of voice teaching that I was trained in and worked in, I would say touch is fundamental and common, actually. And I don't actually think that your conception of touch is that different. I was thinking this morning about perhaps it's useful to contextualize my work and the work of people who trained in the Central School of Speech and Drama tradition, and as much as we can talk about traditions, because the evolution of that in the British Drama School was very closely related to the presence of the Alexander technique. So the schools I worked at, there was a touch-based modality, which would have a different sort of idea, perhaps a mechanism of action or an idea about what touch is. But that was fundamental to the students. So when I taught at RADA for many years, and the Alexander technique was completely woven into the school. Mm-hmm. Every teacher had an understanding of it. The students were used to being touched. They had individual lessons, several lessons a week. The voice department and the Alexander department worked together closely. So actually, I wouldn't say there was a kind of a period when I didn't touch and a period when I did touch. They were always interwoven, and touching of all kinds was very much part of my training and of my practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, there isn't a kind of a clear distinction in my mind between my career as a voice teacher and my career as a manual therapist stroke voice teacher. I always used touch, and I always found it, well, I think I probably didn't think about it for a long time. It was just what we did.
Right.
And when I started thinking about it, I found it to be profoundly useful.
Yeah. You touched on mechanism of action in terms of how I'm gonna generalize here and say I think most people see there's a very different mechanism of action between the touch of manual therapy, the touch of massage, and the touch of touch-based cueing. And I use the words touch-based cueing, and I know that goes by different phrasing, but one of my missions over the last couple of years has been to sort of maybe see that as more of a screen or lack of a wall between manual therapy touch and touch-based cueing, because the mechanism of action historically with massage, with manual therapy, has traditionally been, there's something, I'm going to generalize here, wrong with the tissues. There's something stuck or dysfunctional or injured about the tissues that we, with our hands, can identify through palpation or evaluation, and then remedy here at the periphery. I mean, I know that's simplistic and everybody's got a different explanation, but that is in general how people have viewed manual therapy touch as being impactful, whereas touch-based cueing was often more of a behavioral, a cognitive, a retraining type of thing, or simply a reminder to, put your head back in alignment, drop your shoulders. But I think so much of the new research is pointing to a lack of a real firm wall between those two types of touch, that manual therapy is less now about what we think we're doing to the tissue, and it's more what's happening with the individual who is receiving the touch, which is incredibly similar to a lot of the new models of what's happening with touch-based cueing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And because my bias is Alexander technique and the Feldenkrais method, and both of those, they're very kind of late 19th century, early 20th century ideas about touch, and they're both rooted in the idea of teaching. I mean, neither of those systems believe that what you're doing is changing people's tissue. It's not deep tissue release or myofascial release or whatever. It's about a communication between the teacher and the touched, which leads to some kind of increase in understanding and growth and an ability to use yourself in a different way. So I find your ideas about what may be happening during manual therapy and my understanding very congruent. I just think of it all as teaching,
Yeah,
and actually
yeah,
more than teaching, learning. I think of it as learning, and learning through a connection between two nervous systems is something that I'm really kind of comfortable with and sort of curiously familiar with, given that it's presented perhaps in the manual therapy world as something innovative. It's familiar to me as an idea.
yeah, yeah. The some of the impetus for this talk also came from a paper that I had not read. You had said you read it a while ago, a paper that was presented on one of the threads on Facebook, done in 2020, called "HandsOn, HandsOff: Pedagogical Touch in the #MeToo Era." And I think, we talked about touch having its sort of, going into hibernation during COVID for many people. But I also think that the Me Too generation, not the Me Too generation, but the Me Too movement, certainly predated COVID in terms of concerns over touch. And what I appreciated this paper, which, by the way, I'm going to link this in the notes for this show. If anybody wants a copy, I can get you a full text copy of that. They cover so many things, many of things that we've touched on already, that you mentioned in terms of the Alexander perspective. But what I just appreciated so much is the authors almost making a connection that I've been making in terms of some of the neurologic and the cognitive behavioral aspects of touch when it comes to C-tactile afferents, being almost necessary. Or no, it's not necessary, because a lot of people do wonderful work in voice without touching. I want to be clear about that. But how for some people, whether it's the clinician or the receiver, right, that touch can be hugely impactful. And that paper to me was just, I'm always looking for bridges, right? Bridges between my world as a physical therapist and your world and anybody else who I get a chance to engage with. I don't know your world, I don't know your training, but can we build a bridge? And to me, this paper was a tremendous bridge with voice coaching, with singing, teaching, and all the other titles that we go by. Because basically, touch has a potential to have some universal qualities, and that's what I really enjoy about this paper. Any comments on the paper itself from you?
I thought it was a really good paper, and I really liked its particular. I think the thing that caught me was the distinction between consent and compliance,
Oh yeah,
which I
yeah,
thought was a really useful definition. And also, I forget now, I haven't got it in front of me, but
yeah,
the particular sort of qualities of consent, one that it needs to be enthusiastic. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because in the context of a drama school and a classroom with young students, potentially adults, but youngish people, I think consent can easily be blurred with compliance. There's an awful lot of hierarchy going on. And also the students want to change. They want to learn. So I found that really, really, really helpful, actually. And I'm going to be thinking about that a lot in my own practice, to make sure that I'm not really employing compliance when I say I'm employing consent.
yeah. Or coercion, which is certainly
Well,
another unspoken aspect there, because the power relationship in any relationship, pedagogical, therapeutic, is typically skewed in favor of the clinician or the teacher. And I think that's one that really needs to be brought out into the light in ways to balance that power, to share decisions. And people come into my room with an expectation to be touched, I think, because I'm a manual therapy practice, but still, I think that a lot needs to go into that engagement before it happens, in terms of permission and understanding. And I think that the authors also do a really good job about talking about that. And some of those comments that I received on my various posts on social media, I think, were making assumptions that power isn't always shared. Power can't be equal, especially someone with past trauma, known or unknown at the time. So yeah, I did appreciate their comments on coercion or consent. So the couple other topics on that paper that I think were really interesting were, they did talk about power, but also when not to touch. Times when touch may not be necessary, or certainly may not be appropriate. Um, And what about you, Robert? How do you how I know that it certainly varies from interaction to interaction, but do you have sort of a protocol that you follow when it comes to permission and understanding why touch might be utilized?
Well, I do as a manual therapist. I have a very clear and coherent one because we work at the Voice Care Center with Stephen King through a thing called the consent equation, which that paper was also mentioned. But I didn't when I was a voice teacher. I didn't have a way of thinking about this. I have to say the Me Too thing is fascinating to me because it's partly not a red herring, but because I'm old enough to have been around for a while, when I started teaching voice and when I started training in the voice, which was late 90s, early noughties, touch was viewed as problematic at that point too. There was quite a lot of discussion within the world I was in about not touch. By the way, I really apologize that the next door neighbors are doing some building work, so I hope that's not coming through. I've been muting when you've been speaking. Oh, we're doing okay. So I thought that was interesting because I've been through sort of periods where touch was very much out of fashion or sort of viewed as problematic or dangerous. And then that period sort of softened. And then the Me Too sort of moment and movement, that sort of stage of our history, cultural history, returned when it returned. I think what's wonderful is that there's been more discussion about how to touch, or perhaps why to touch or not to touch. So it feels like it's a more sophisticated conversation, actually, because the conversation when I was a young voice teacher was either kind of don't touch people because of the risk, mostly then about abuse. Trauma wasn't hugely discussed or understood, I think. And then it was do touch, do what you like. You know, people need to be touched. It's necessary in order to move students through what they need to move through, or at least an efficient way of doing that. But I can remember having some not traumatic experience. I wouldn't call them traumatic, but I can remember being in some classes with people when they would do things like, I remember somebody coming over without any kind of consent or conversation at all and putting their full weight down into the area sort of beneath my xiphoid process region of the diaphragm, I suppose, but putting their full weight into that area in order to kind of sink down onto the spine. I mean, my aorta was thumping, I could see it going through the whole body. And when they withdrew, I certainly experienced a release. I certainly experienced something that I think may have had some value to me. But at the same time, the interaction was so curious and so confusing and so coercive. I mean, I think that's a really lovely thought that we can have a continuum from the coercive to the what was our term? So we've got consent, compliance, and coercion.
Right.
They kind of live on a line, I think, to me, and certainly a lot of the way I experienced touch in the past was coercion. I mean, there was no choice at all.
Yeah. But then, then I look at in manual therapy in terms of the vast continuum of pressures from what one person might view as absurdly light pressures of a certain style of intervention to almost brutally aggressive. And when someone comes to see me with my sign on the door that I do X modality, which is known to be really aggressive, I don't want to get into finger pointing at all. They're coming in to see me with the expectation that, first of all, I'm going to use that. And number two, I know it's effective. And compliance, I think, can be very nuanced there. And are they really complying, or are they simply willing to put up with something just to improve from a pain perspective? And I think the same sort of rules and problems can arise in the teaching, the pedagogical setting, in terms of what a person is willing to expect. Because you know what, Robert, you are an expert, and I put a lot of faith in you. I'm coming to see you, or you're a part of this program that I'm a part of, and I'm it's permission is nuanced. And I believe that before we do anything, we really should be, laying things out. Here's what I want to do. Here's why I want to do it. Here's your ability to say, no, I don't think that's safe, or I don't think that's necessary, right? I don't know that whether it's the student or the patient is often given those true choices. in my world, it's like, well, do what you think is best. We hear that all the time. Do what you think will help. And it's like, well, my thoughts are just my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Right. And that's a hard one. And that's almost a conversation, a different conversation. It's one I have a lot in my classes and with my patients, getting them to understand that it doesn't have to hurt to help. What you described, that deep pressure on the diaphragm, man, I learned that in a mouthwash release class, where basically not only putting pressure in, but then you're coming up into the diaphragm to try and, not trying almost, but to almost invoke a cathartic response on that person. The release is not just a physical release of the perception of the tissue, but a release of the emotion. And I think that's really straying from our lane as whoever we are as a clinician. So, a lot
Yeah.
packed in there.
Yeah, and that's really interesting from the point of view of acting training, because the cathartic moment was something that was sought out by students. I mean, perhaps because they've been trained to think that. And of course, in the world of theatre, again, maybe even more than the world of singing, emotion is absolutely, or emotional freedom or emotional flexibility is a component part of what you're training people in. So there's a really curious space where students would go to an acting class and they're looking for that kind of experience. And then the voice department and the physical department, the people who worked with the body, were kind of supposed to facilitate that. So I can remember students being in classes that I was teaching, whereas I now think they had a response which was to do with trauma. They had a kind of a meltdown that actually I don't think was really contributing to their growth as artists. I think it was a phenomenon that arose out of the work, may have had some value for them, may not. I had no particular way of understanding or curating that. But I think, I wouldn't say at its worst, because of course I worked in places where fine actors were well trained and became very, very good adult artists. I don't think it was a bad thing, but I don't think we were thinking deeply enough or accurately enough about the way that people were moving through those kinds of programs.
Right. So in terms of our original reason for being here, do you feel like touch is necessary in your work or in the work of your colleagues, not necessarily as a massage therapist, but in the go ahead.
As a voice teacher, as an acting teacher, is that the question?
Yeah.
Necessary is a curious word, isn't it? I think it's often very efficient. I think there are connections and changes that people can find through touch that they may not have found through image-based work or through exercises or through even an anatomical understanding. I mean, I think sometimes you can teach something about function, about use through touch in a way that's either quite quick and relatively quick, efficient, or sometimes helps somebody to learn something that they maybe wouldn't have been able to understand or learn otherwise. So I think sometimes it's essential. I think often it's efficient. I think many times it's beautiful. And I think that I facilitate big classes with students working together through touch. That's one of the things that I have always done. And a lot of the time I find that to be just wonderful and very moving and very special in terms of the way that builds an ensemble, changes people's relationships with their body. They start to understand things about other people's bodies. There's a whole aspect of that which is social. I think it's your colleague Diane Jacobs who talks about social grooming as perhaps being what therapists do. And I certainly think I facilitated an awful lot of social grooming. And I think that was very important to people and very potentially healing. I mean, I think that's why I'm on the kind of touch camp, I suppose, because although I completely accept the risks of that being a vehicle for abuse, and I think that is a bit of a red herring, because I think that exists in all professions. I think dentists can be abusive. I think psychotherapists can be abusive. I mean, I think people should work on themselves and make sure that they're not. And I think that organizations need to have good safeguarding and make sure they find the right people. That's a reasonable fear, but I certainly don't want to live my life out of fear. The other question of how we create responses to past trauma, I think that's fascinating and really complicated. But yeah, I think touch is necessary. I don't know. I mean, also, as you said, good teachers teach many things without using touch as a modality. So I wouldn't go as far as to say necessary.
Yeah.
But I think many things are not necessary that we value and cherish and encourage. And I don't think cheese is necessary, but I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. I also think that it's so much a product not of the actual act of touching being the thing that changes, but it's a perception of both the receiver who might feel touch is useful or it was key in them, but also I think it's a lot on us, the clinician, on what we believe is necessary, is most helpful, and the realization that no interaction, therapeutic interaction or pedagogical interaction, no interaction is one-sided. We're both completely involved in that interaction. It's not the researcher as observer, it's really the researcher as participant. And when I move into a space, what I think is helpful and necessary is incredibly influenced by my perceptions, my past, my experiences. And I think the same thing goes for the teacher, what they think is useful. And what I read on a lot of those comments on the threads that I posted were people's perceptions and their own experiences. And, the person who's talking about, trauma and the concerns of a trauma may or may not have their own trauma issues themselves, much like me, who uses touch, having trauma issues. So this is messy work that we try and simplify and make into, trying to make it seem like, here's the recipe that works. The paper that we reference is by Thuma and Miranda. I think they unpack that really well and talk about the complexities of that ultimately touch is a beautiful and often useful experience, but yet we find ways to work around a lot of things, whether it's touch-based or non-touch-based. And I think that's certainly one of the take-homes that I'm not. I didn't instigate this talk between you and I to try and convince other people that touching is beneficial and necessary, but I think it's also interesting to talk about the overlap between the various sorts of touches, and that the paper talked about it, you've talked about it, I talk about it all the time. So yeah, anything else you feel is necessary to insert here?
No, I suppose, I mean, touch-based cueing as a phrase is not one. I mean, you said at the beginning of the podcast, and we didn't really do it to kind of define the terms.
Yeah.
That was a really good thought. I mean, it's becoming, I think, something that I command as a phrase. I don't know where I got that from. I don't think it was a part of my training. I don't think it's a term that I would have understood 5 years ago. So what do you mean by touch-based cueing? And then maybe I can talk about how I my teaching.
Well, the perfect example that I often give when I'm teaching is touch-based cueing could be something like if you see a person having, forward head, and you're then seeing a negative, what you view as a negative in their voice, in their actions, in their movement. In touch-based cueing, you might say, okay, tuck your chin back, right? That cue via touch to alter a postural alignment, for instance. And when someone does that, often the person responds in a way, oh, it's almost like they're saying, oh, you mean like this, right? And then they may speak, sing, move in a different way. And you then see that probably as a behavioral influence that you just created, a top-down awareness. And I, as a physical therapist doing manual therapy, might touch that same spot, but I might touch and hold for minutes on end with a perception that as I hold that input, I'm altering fascial muscle, nerve relationships and causing a change in the tissue. Again, that's to me the wall between touch-based cueing and manual therapy that I think a lot of people recognize as real, that the mechanism of action is different. But in reality, I think, at least in some cases, that the mechanisms might be either nearly identical or at least a massive amount of overlap in being identical.
Yeah, because I think what I would have thought I was doing when I put my hand on somebody's shoulder or put my hand on somebody's abdomen or moved their weight slightly forward or slightly back when they were in action, when they were performing a function, I think what I would have once thought was that essentially what I was doing was releasing tension or helping them to become monomotivated, to help them simplify an action in order to make it more efficient. Now, I think there are questions about that. But if that's what I thought I was doing, that's actually not so different, actually. I mean, I wouldn't have had a sort of a vocabulary about fascia, or I wouldn't have particularly thought those thoughts. But if what I think I'm doing is teaching somebody to use themselves better by adjusting something about their tension, then I think they map really closely. And actually, the touches that I was taught and that I would practice were often quite slow. I think lots of voice teachers actually have really good hands because we're used to inviting somebody's body to make some kind of a change. I suspect it's not in the actual operation or the reception necessarily that different. I mean, that's why I don't think I've changed career. They've blended quite nicely together.
Yeah.
We would also use touch quite a lot within exercises. So we would do things where we shake things out or move things around or invite different parts of the body. So it wasn't always about quite how you describe a sort of an adjustment to posture. Sometimes it was more about the acquisition of an exercise or an investigation accurately. So it's sort of how somebody is doing something, perhaps. Yeah.
You know, I keep referring back to the Thuma and Miranda paper. You know, they list 8 reasons why touch benefits.
Yeah.
You know, you're of my age, at least general age. I'm not quite sure how old you are, but do you remember when an anatomy book might have those plastic overlays, right? Inside the book, when it came to learning anatomy, you know, those clear plastic overlays where you open that first page and you see the fully you know, the human with skin on, and then you lift one page and you kind of drop layer by layer by layer. And I use that as a teaching model in terms of my own work, in terms of, well, anatomy is important, but which layer is the important one, right? Because you could make a case for all of them. And in a way, what I'm seeing with those 8 main ways that the authors talk about the benefit of touch is almost a similar Mylar type of a overlay with me, because what they're talking about to bring an awareness in specific ways, I could probably change the phrasing a little bit, but also see how manual therapy could be impactful in that same way and work our way down the list. And, you know, the longer I'm interacting with folks like you at a live workshop or online, the more I'm seeing marked similarities in the work that we do, even though, you know, our background, our education, what initials we put after our name, and then how the public perceives us are completely different. But I'm seeing so much that, you know, we're almost doing the same thing, but from a different recipe, from a different set of languages and tools. And I think that's a pretty cool thing to see, that, you know, we're all not so different, and seeing ourselves in having a place in each other's world.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. And I always wonder about how much knowledge increases facility or effectiveness. I mean, that's something I find endlessly fascinating. I hope it does. I'm not sure. I don't know whether 25 years ago, when I first put my hand on a student's shoulder, I was less helpful than I am now. I don't know. I hope so.
So,
I hope I'm
you know,
more...
yeah, if I could just follow up on that. 25 years ago, I'm guessing when you put your hands on someone's shoulders, you may have, I'm going to insert this here, you may have a perception of why you did that and what you hope to accomplish. Has your view now changed in 25 years of doing essentially the identical thing, but are you thinking different thoughts? Is your intention different? You know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think my intention now would be more inclusive. So I think I would frame it that way. So I wouldn't think now that I was about fixing somebody's structure to some kind of ideal structure in order that they can do what they're going to do. I think that the body is more complex now, and I think I understand the presence of culture in that. So I think I would now think about offering some potential options. I think I would think about choice, and choice being built on knowledge. Whereas I think before I probably thought there was a kind of a more or less right way to do things.
Right, right. A lot of that comes with maturity, though, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully.
And
Although
honestly, the
people can
more
become more conservative. People
do
can
what?
become more sorry, the
Yeah,
training. People
yeah,
can become more conservative, actually. People can deepen into their perspective and their position. It's the one thing I find ugly in pedagogy. I'm very nervous of anybody who increasingly thinks they're right.
yeah, yeah. And to me, I voice this quite frequently. The more I learn, the less of which I'm certain. Right. When I touched 25 years ago and put my hands on somebody's shoulders in a myofascial model, I was certain that I was releasing tight connected tissue. And now I don't think that at all, and maybe I know less, but I think now what I'm trying to do is simply build awareness to allow them the choice instead of me being the institution for change or the instigator for change. Seeing them as capable of change, and I'm just giving them a cue. And that's where I see, again, to go back to the original point here, that's where I see that massive overlap between what I view as manual therapy and what others view as, simple touch as a part of a pedagogy type experience. And I don't think we're all that different. So, yeah, I guess, as we get older, we'll continue to know less, right? Or be
I think so.
certain of less. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You just said something I thought was really lovely, actually, seeing them as being capable of change.
Yeah.
I think that's a phrase I'm going to hold on to. I like that. I think that's right. Mm.
Yeah. Well, they rely so much on us to institute change, to create change, whether it's in a teaching setting or a therapeutic setting, and which all comes with the territory. Let's face it. It's part of why they're paying us. But I think so much of the new views on manual therapy impacts are less about what I'm doing to the tissue and more about what I'm creating from a sense of awareness to allow them to change on their own. And I just think that's such a lovely thought. And I know that a lot of clinicians don't like that because it removes a bit of that ego or a bit of that that godlike quality that people like to own and people like to give to others. So it's a tough one when I teach because I'm asking them to step down from that pedestal and see themselves as an equal with their patient, with their client.
Yeah, it's very tempting to want to be a magician. I mean, I think in the world that I come from, the world of theatre and film and teaching, that, I mean, I don't know the world of manual therapy that well. If that's an issue in the world of manual therapy, it would definitely have been, I think still probably is, an issue in the world of acting teaching and singing teaching because yeah, people like to think they're magic. And I get that.
Yeah,
I get why it's a
yeah,
nice feeling. It's nice to
yeah,
think that you're magic. It's
yeah,
it's a risk.
yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me here today. And I'm going to put a link to how people can find you on the notes with this video, and I'm also going to link this paper that I've been talking about throughout the talk. So thanks so much for joining me, Robert. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
It was a pleasure, Will. Thanks
Great.
for having
Yeah.
me. Great.